Welcome to part 2 of our episode on The Last Jedi with special guest Becky Allen. We now return you to the discussion that started in part 1. Well, and I can't think of a smooth transition here, but let's shift back to Rey, because in a way it's interesting to me that Rey is such the dominant person of The Force Awakens and is such an amazing new character and has a really powerful story in this movie as well, but one that doesn't get talked about anywhere near as much, at least in the conversations I'm having. And we talked about it a little bit in terms of that one moment, but overall, Becky, what was sort of your take on where they go with what you talked about, how you were fearful about what they might do with Rey. What was your overall take on what they did with Rey in this movie, and how do you see where she is at the end of the movie?
I liked it a lot. I think I don't think she had as defined an arc as Finn or Poe did.
Yeah.
But she was still wonderful. I love that when she sees the dark side, she's curious and she wants to know what it is, and she literally jumps in to explore it and is like, "Oh, yeah, that didn't give me anything. All right, that's not what I want," and moves on. And Luke is horrified, because she doesn't try and resist. She doesn't run away from it. She's not afraid of it. She just wants to know what's happening and understand. And she gets that kind of understanding and is able to continue on. And I loved. You know from having spoken with me previously, I do not like Kylo Ren. Mm-hmm. And the idea of that ship is ugh to me.
Emo McBrooklyn, emo boy is not your favorite?
He's not. But I will say that the movie really impressed me in how it pulled the two of them together and gave them an actual relationship. And I love that Rey was seeking understanding there too. That she wanted to know the truth. She wanted to know why Kylo Ren turned out so horribly. She was willing to give him the benefit of a doubt that, Luke had maybe done something bad. And she really wanted to understand what had made him into a monster. And because she had some understanding, she was able to see, it doesn't have to be like this. You can also move on from the bad things you've done and the ways that you have failed and come back and be better. And that was why she went after him. And I will say, hands down, the best, most unexpected, coolest moment to me of the entire movie was when he kills Snoke, and it genuinely, for that fight scene, feels like, oh my god, she did it? He's good now? He's what? It was such an unexpected moment of getting rid of the big bad, and it works because Kylo Ren is now the big bad, but because she had been so determined and so passionate, and we'd seen that relationship suddenly, it felt plausible. And so the movie having that moment was really, really cool.
And we also get in that moment Kylo Ren's major failure in the movie, which is he's so close. He is so close. And then he still wants Rey, even though Rey was the one who's walked him through part of this journey, who's helped him see some of the damage around him. He still says, "Join me and we'll do things." Yeah, so close, Kylo. But no, you're the one who needs wisdom. Well, and Rey is the one who's going to give it to you as the wisest Jedi.
He says, let go of the past, kill the past, burn it down, whatever, but he is ultimately the one who can't do that.
Yeah,
right. And he thinks that getting rid of the past is murdering his mother, I guess. But actually, if he were able to let go of the past, he would have been able to take Rey's hand and go with him back to being a better person, because it would be facing, the worst things that he's done and accepting them and figuring out how to move on. And so I think that was also part of the movie's message, was when you accept that and you face it, you find peace like Luke did. And if you just try and ignore that and close yourself off, then you are a villain. And that, to me, it all worked really well.
So
you're a villain, or you're... Oh, go on.
I'm going to open up a potential can of worms that we probably could do an entire series of podcasts on, but it's an issue that I am so intrigued by and want to hear you guys talk about, and it's so linked to this, which is the idea of, like, throughout all of these movies, we have been told that the Force has a light side and the dark side, and that they are the Jedi and the Sith. Full stop, end of story. And the prequels, I think, were attempting to give us a little bit of it's not that simple, but they did a bad job of it. The TV show The Clone Wars actually, I think, does a much better job of it. But in this movie, and I'm wondering if I'm reading in what I wanted to see, or if you guys saw this as well, especially in that scene, part of what I saw happening was it wasn't just that Rey was sort of pulling him over to the light side and making him a Jedi. It was that they were both connecting out of this sense of, what Kylo was being taught by Snoke wasn't quite working for him. What she was being taught by Luke wasn't quite working for her. And they were almost sort of like creating the Grey Jedi for a minute there, of trying to find a moment of, is there some balance between this? And is there some middle ground that is much more about Rey coming over much more about Kylo Ren redeeming himself, because Rey doesn't have anything she needs to be redeemed for. But she is somewhat rejecting a lot of the Jedi ideas. Do you think that there was some moment there of them both rejecting kind of that old model of Jedi equals good, Sith equals bad, things are all very clear in black and white?
Yes. I think that that's been part of Kylo Ren basically since he was introduced. Because through the first movie, his conflict is that the light side keeps calling to him, and he wants to be a Darth Vader fanboy, and he doesn't want to be in the light side mom. And it was much more ridiculous in the first movie, and then I think that the struggle felt a lot more, to me, less adolescent teen angst and more actual struggle in The Last Jedi. But that his conflict has always been he decided he was going to be on the dark side now, and there's still good in him, and he's fighting to not have that come out. Whereas Rey, again, the dark side called to her and she was like, hey, what's all this? Cool. Yeah. Okay. And Luke's horror at that, because she didn't fight against it, it was just something that was part of the Force to her. Right. To me, those are both things that speak to, it's not that some people are good and some people are bad, and some Force users are Sith and some Force users are Jedi. It's that individual people have both good and bad in them, and they have to balance it.
And Luke should know better on that, right? Luke absolutely should know better on that, with both the redemption of Darth Vader and the fact that he's used the Force for offense, and he's also confronted the darkness in the cave on Dagobah, and that was like a formative experience for him, and that's what taught him that you could touch the darkness and come back from it. And then when that's what Rey wants to do, you're exactly right, Becky, that his reaction is horror rather than, no, you really should know what this is so that you know what you're trying to fight against.
Well, and I think that's part of why that scene of him and Yoda, Ghost Yoda, sitting, and Yoda eventually, like, burning down the last vestiges of the Jedi is so important, because what I saw there was Luke is, as much as he has kind of sort of recognized that maybe the dark side and the light side aren't so clearly like binary, that he's still bought into so much of the Jedi teaching of, and that, to me, one of the most powerful parts of this whole movie is there's that one line where he says that the Jedi don't have a monopoly on the Force and never should, and that their mistake was thinking they should. I'm going to go on a small tangent here, but I just think it's such a fascinating thing. As many of our listeners know, I used to be a pastor, and I'm still very involved in theological discussions and phrases and things like that. And there's a whole sort of side world that I'm a part of progressive theologians who have all been loving this movie, especially from the idea of the movie kind of being a wonderful critique of organized religion and sort of what happens when people who believe in spiritual teachings that are theoretically like bigger and more out of their understanding than themselves start to believe in not the God they're theoretically pointing to, but to themselves, the church hierarchy, or in this case, the Jedi hierarchy. And there's been some fantastic scholarship that I'll link a little bit of too for any church nerds who might be out there in our listenership, but also just for anyone who's interested in this idea of the Jedi as a model of the dangers of organized religion or of organized establishments of those kinds that can become where the hierarchy takes on more power than it should. And to me, one of the things that most symbolized this, and I think there was a moment where Luke sort of said that Rey is the last Jedi, and I was like, no, I don't want her to be a Jedi. I want her to be something new. But that I'm hoping they're going in a new direction is that line that we've talked about already of Rose saying, fight for what you love. Part of what I thought about there is that this continual idea that the Jedi were always saying, and that was so hard on Anakin, which is to be the person who fights for good, you can't love anything. And I think it must have been intentional. I certainly hope it was. But to me, Rose's line of, fight for what you love is such a rejection of that Jedi ideal that got everyone in so much trouble in the first place.
I absolutely agree. And I am not a religion nerd at all, but for me, that was actually one of the things that I most noticed about the movie is there are a couple, close-ups of those books, and it's the sacred texts, and they've been there for 1,000 generations, and Luke can't quite bring himself to destroy those, even though he genuinely believes that the Jedi Order has caused all of these problems, and Yoda is like, no, we don't need them. We really don't.
Yeah.
And reinforces that there was wisdom in them, but that everything Rey needs she already has because she has hope and she cares about people and she wants to redeem them, and she's driven by her relationship with Finn and her faith that Kylo Ren can be redeemed, and she has those connections, and those are what drives her, as opposed to trying to adhere to a religion because it's what it said in a book 1,000 generations ago that you shouldn't have those attachments. And so to me, sort of that rejection of you don't need to follow what's in a book just because the book is old and had some good ideas. You need to look at the world as it is now and do what's good in the world as it is now. To me, also felt like a rejection of certain kinds of organized religion in a way that was surprisingly powerful because, again, I'm not at all religious.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I also agree, Matthew, that's a big point that the movie was attempting to get at, and I felt like it was done pretty well. There is that moment that cheapens, I feel, the moment when Yoda was like, nope, light it up, this was bad, we need to start over, we need something else, was so powerful to me because Yoda was presented to us throughout all of these movies as, this guy really he's a true believer, he's very, very wise. To see him reject the teachings of the Jedi Order or say this is not what we need anymore was so potent. And then it was cheapened because we saw some of the texts on the Falcon. And so now Yoda's line of she already has what she needs takes on a completely different meaning. And really, when I saw that turned my stomach a little bit. I was like, we were so close, and yet we're still going to get this. We're still going to say that, oh, no, she's still going to be a Jedi, and I'm hoping that doesn't happen. To answer your question from earlier, Matthew, is I'm hopeful that neither Kylo Ren / Ben nor Rey continue on with these ancient traditions that are clearly damaging each in different ways, clearly the cause of problems, that they recognize they need something new.
Well, I've had a real evolution about that moment because I started where you do, but Becky, I want to start by giving you a chance. What was your take on the saving of the books?
I hadn't noticed it, so I do not have a take on it.
Okay. I, Jacob, had at first the exact same response you did, but what I've come to is it's I think, burn the books, ignore them all. In some ways, that's Kylo's response. That's the burn the past, ignore all of it. Whereas I think what Rey is doing there is saying, I'm going to reject the Jedi. I'm going to reject all of these institutions. I'm going to reject the idea that these books are sacred text that I must listen to and obey. But that doesn't mean the books might still have some good ideas. I think I kind of like, Becky, what you were saying about Rey looking at the dark side and going, oh, this is interesting, but not really my bag. I feel like there's something really interesting about her being able to say, the Jedi had some good points, and maybe even the Sith had a decent point or two. And I'm going to find my own way with this and go my own direction, not feeling like I have to follow rigidly the teachings of the past, but also not feeling like I have to run away from them.
think that's a really good read on the situation, especially since, as Becky's pointed out, Rey is probably the wisest of the Jedi pupils, at least, if not of the Jedi Masters, that we've seen in how she approaches all of these different situations. She has this compulsion to understand what's going on and how these other people are thinking and what these other forces are about, but also seems to be just admirably incorruptible by them. Just like she's curious, and which is a great thing, and she embraces that curiosity, but she doesn't allow any particular event to rule her. Just incredibly admirable character, and as you were saying that, I thought, of course, yes, that has to be where they're going with it, and I hope that is where they're going with it, because that fits into the narrative so well, for the same reason that she went, oh, let me see what this whole dark side thing is about, let me fall down this hole and see what's down here. And yes, in part of that was because she wanted to learn about her background, learn where she came from, and ultimately finds out it doesn't matter. And honestly, her general acceptance of that, again, is just, gosh, she's just so wise. I'm very impressed with the character of Rey, if you can't tell.
Yeah. I think I had two points listening to that. And one is that Yoda literally says, like, there were good ideas in these books, but that's about it. Yeah, I think the line, because I loved it, was wisdom they had, page turners they were not. Which is such a good line. So I think that,
I'm sorry, very quick interruption, but just that line has been quoted by so many of my theologian friends about the Bible, as we're talking about, like, what does it mean to be modern Christians, and to acknowledge, like, we can still find a lot of meaning in this book, but page turner it is not. Sorry, but go ahead, Becky.
No, well, exactly. And I think that's also part of why the line is so powerful, because I think that explicitly says, like, look at something like the Bible. These are sacred texts that we're now going to do, not necessarily entirely ignore or entirely burn down. We'll save the good ideas, but we don't need to adhere to them, like to the parts that are outdated. And then the other thing that I was going to say was Rey, like, she did have one thing in her past that was driving her, which was not knowing who her parents were. And she confronts it. She finds out, if we assume that Kylo Ren was telling the truth, she confronts it, and it's really hard, and then she moves on. And that she can confront what she is most upset about, which is not a failure in her case, because she didn't do anything to her parents, they just abandoned her, but that she can confront what's really upsetting about her past and still say, okay, but that doesn't mean that I get to step aside, or just because I am really upset about this, I don't need to, join the dark side. I don't need to let go of my friends and let them be killed by this guy who I maybe have an attachment to now. I can confront this and learn about who I am and understand myself better and move on from it. Which is what none of the other characters were really able to do as well, which was sort of the difference in how you handle failure.
So one thing that's occurring to me as I'm hearing this, and as we're talking about just how amazing Rey is, especially as a young Jedi.
It's so great.
And again, I don't know if this is intentional. There may be a lot of times where the writers just sort of stumbled into brilliance. But, what is the theme we keep hearing about both Anakin and Luke, and why we don't want to train them yet? They're too old. They are not, the Jedi are so dedicated to this, take people when they are barely, like, walking toddlers. We want them to be the youngest possible so that the Jedi can shape them from birth, and that's so much of their idea. Rey is the oldest, the most independent person when she discovers the Force of any of the Force-using characters we've ever seen. And
I have a very strange way... So on. Sorry.
So yeah, we both were like, ooh, things to say. But if you want to look at the parallel,
go on.
In this trilogy, the character who is taken almost at birth and raised with a certain set of beliefs is Finn. And it's what happens when he's essentially brainwashed by the First Order and raised as a stormtrooper. And that's not good.
And it's funny, I said yup because I thought you were going to say Kylo Ren. But you're right, Finn is also just as interesting a one there.
Yeah, I was going to say that... by shape, you had a very interesting way of saying the word indoctrinate.
Yeah.
Which, is exactly to Becky's point. That's what happened with Finn. And Finn would get really messed up. And somehow, in a lot of ways, his character, the most heroic thing about his character was that he got out of that mess.
Yeah.
And he still managed to, get out with his humanity and his compassion intact, and like is trying to make a difference. Whereas so obviously so many of those first order soldiers are, well, just buying into it, hook, line, and sinker.
I think it's definitely true. Is there anything else we want to say about Luke or Rey? There's one or two more big topics I want to make sure we cover, but I want to see if there's anything else on those we wanted to hit.
I think those were all my big points.
I could talk for a very long time about Rey in particular, but we should probably move on.
Well, let's go a little bit more meta, which is, one of the large sources of discussion around this movie has been the criticisms of it. And I think we have now seen that the movie was not as critically the original story that the fans all hated is actually been somewhat overblown, in large part because it seems there was this conspiracy of Gamergate style fanboys to drive down the ratings on Rotten Tomatoes. They've now targeted Black Panther as their next target, saying that it has nothing to do with race. It's just their issues with Marvel that. You can't see on a podcast how much my R's are rolling as I say that. But
I heard it.
There you go. But even so, clearly there's been, a lot of folks who were not happy with this movie, especially with the direction of Luke and the idea of Poe, being the failure. What was your guys' take on that sort of backlash and what that's saying about kind of the fandom around Star Wars?
I mean, I think it says that when people are attached to a hero, they really do not want to see that hero fail.
Yeah.
And that's understandable, right?
Yeah.
That's not even necessarily something that we should admonish. Perhaps the way in which you react should be tempered some. And maybe you don't go attacking other characters because of it that were also perfectly reasonable. Maybe, I don't know.
Well, I think it's not just like, oh, we don't want to see our heroes fail, but I think it's when you have and I mean, you talked about this a bit on your episode about real life heroes, but like when you have someone on a pedestal, the amount that it hurts when they do something you don't agree with or that you think is wrong, it feels not just like this person has failed, but like a part of you has maybe failed because you believed in them and thought that they were better than that. And that's sort of the danger of putting people on pedestals. But I do think that some of the hurt reactions to Luke were people who felt like, obviously he's a fictional character, but who felt that sense of like, oh, I loved this character and I really didn't want to see him do any wrong. I don't want to deal with the fact that he could do something wrong, because if the great, legendary, heroic Luke Skywalker can mess up that badly, like, what does that say about me? Because I always, believed in him. I
always believed that one good guy with a lightsaber and one good guy with a gun can take care of things. It's for me, it almost reminds me a little bit of the recent remake of Ghostbusters, in that how both movies wound up being fairly meta and fairly like critiquing the critiques that the movie winds up having. In that, you have all of these fanboys who are so upset about Luke not being the hero that they want him to be. An essential part of Luke's story is him wrestling with all of these people wanting him to be the hero that he can't be. And to me, I don't know if that's brilliance on the movie making or just the fact that a lot of people utterly missed the point of the movie. But I thought, to me, the movie winds up being such a great critique of the parts of fandom that are causing the backlash.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm willing to take the leap of giving the writers the credit for that particular point or not. It is internally consistent with Luke's character in those moments, and to build the narrative that they're building, regardless of whether it was intentional that, hey, people are going to react this way, let's try to preempt it a little bit. I do find it interesting that because Luke himself is disappointed in what has happened, but he acknowledges that part of it was this problem where there was this expectation that no one really could meet. That's not a real person, and that a lot of people got upset because that heroic figure got taken down a notch or two. I actually think it is more interesting and more believable that even Luke had this humongous success in turning Darth Vader back just before, at the end, turning Darth Vader back. One of the biggest moments so far in Star Wars canon. And to think that, well, from that point forward, he's never going to make another mistake. He's never going to do anything wrong. There's never going to be any tragedy that comes from his actions personally is just woefully naive. And honestly, I think that if that's how you reacted, I'm sorry that you felt betrayed by that particular point in the movie, but it wasn't really that surprising to me. I felt it just made a better story.
I agree. I actually do. My read on it was, I think, similar to Matthew's in that it felt like it was to me, it felt like it was sort of meta commentary as well as being a really well thought out storyline that was in keeping with Luke. But yeah, and I think that when we talk about reaction, I think that there should be sort of a line drawn between people who were disappointed or would have liked the story to go in a different direction or whatever, who handled it the way I handled the Rey is not a Skywalker reveal, which is to say, I'm disappointed. I wanted what I wanted to happen, and it didn't, and that's a bummer, but I still, the movie was really good. And the difference between that and people throwing a temper tantrum.
Yeah.
Because there's a difference between critiquing a movie or acknowledging that you had a lot of emotion caught in it and that, you're let down by it, and being entitled and demanding that the movie makers should only do what you want them to and trying to sign a petition to get it canceled out of the canon. And
right.
And especially, I was offline during the worst of it because I didn't see the movie for a few days after it came out and I didn't want to be spoiled. Mm-hmm. So I missed most of the worst of it, which I'm very glad about. So I wasn't there to observe whether it was as directly racist and misogynist as the backlash to The Force Awakens. Mm-hmm. But I suspect that those things were also tied up in it of, how dare you take this away from me and ruin my hero and make the heroes other people? Which, again, is not just entitled, but is horrible.
There was definitely some misogyny going on in the reaction. It's unfortunate and a problem with our culture. Topic for a different time, perhaps, but yeah.
Well, but I think it's worth commenting on. I mean, because certainly we've talked a lot about Luke. I mean, one of the other major points of backlash was the Poe storyline, especially with I keep it's Hodor because it's not Hodor. Holdo. Thank you, Holdo. I am so terrible with names all the time. Jacobs had to remind me of numerous names of characters as we go. But I think her storyline with Poe is one that hit a lot of, and again it's the sort of like people just not wanting to see the point because it's the, folks saying like, no, the male, why does the male have to get yelled at by the woman? Like, can't she just let him go and do his thing? But I also think, Becky, what you're talking about, that it wasn't just coming from that direction. I mean, a huge part of the backlash I saw was the people who were really invested in the Finn Poe slash, and they were coming from a perspective of wanting the movie to have been queerer, which I can very much understand on that regard. But I also think plays into the point you're making of there's a real difference between, not liking an element of a story versus spending a couple of years speculating on a possibility in a story and then being upset that speculation doesn't happen.
Right, and we have a lot of that with different expected romances that people were eager about in the Last Jedi, or in from The Force Awakens in The Last Jedi. In particular, I'm very happy that it looks like where we're going is that Finn and Poe are really good friends, and Rey and Finn are really good friends, because we really need to normalize that this is a thing, this can happen, and we should be happy about it, rather than there has to be like, there are two attractive people on screen that interact in a positive manner, there has to be sexual tension, and they have to secretly want each other. I would love to get away from that.
Well, I mean, I would have been perfectly happy if they had decided that those two would fall for each other, and I would really like to see an LGBT character somewhere in the Star Wars universe. I mean, I think that's
absolutely
a lack. But anyway, we're going back and forth. Becky, what's kind of your take there?
Yeah, no, I thought this movie So one of the things that I don't want to say that bummed me out because it didn't. Like I said, I liked Rose and Finn a lot, and if they get together, I will be really happy.
Hmm.
But it felt to me like that, again, from a storytelling perspective, but that was a way that they could be like, okay, so Finn will have a happy ending with her, so he and Rey are not going to get together, which was really walking back some like their flirting and some of the relationship from The Force Awakens,
Yep.
which to me seemed kind of like it was clearing the way to make some sort of romance type thing part of the redemption of Kylo Ren, which
Oh my God, I hope not.
right, right, like that's the thing is I
Right.
also really hope not. I super don't want that. I think I'm less horrified by it now than I was after The Force Awakens because they did actually build up a relationship between those two characters. So at
Yeah.
least now I've seen them interact, and their interactions were actually really interesting. But not for me.
Well, if
I
there's,
want it.
yeah.
But
If there's
the
anybody who,
so just the other thing that I want to say that I wonder about is sort of how race plays into that.
Yep.
And I don't feel qualified to speak on that at all definitively, but it did occur to me that that was stopping an interracial couple so that the potentially the two white characters who have been introduced would end up together and introducing another non-white character for the non-white guy to end up with. And I, like I said, I don't know enough to really do much analysis on that. But it did certainly occur to me that breaking up a couple that was interracial so that a couple of white people could get together is maybe not the best.
Yeah, I definitely, that is a good, like you, I'm not going to try and claim to really know the ins and outs of that issue. But I do know that's one that I read some very good analysis on. Especially going into this movie, there was a lot of concern of like that in some ways having Finn even be able to have some kind of romantic feelings towards Rey in the first movie was so groundbreaking, and there was a fear of them walking back from it. And in turn,
Please share that link. I would really like to read it.
yeah, I'll see if I can dig up again. And I think the show notes for this are going to be very long. But also
Well, the episode's going to be pretty long.
yeah,
so.
this is also true. But shh, we're not looking at the clock. But but also just on the Rey Kylo thing, again, because of how much in the prequels, this central idea of Anakin's failing was this idea that he's a Jedi and thus cannot be in love. On the one hand, I would love the idea of Rey finding that she can fully love someone and have a romance as a Force user, and then that's totally okay. And that is such a great rejection of the Jedi ideals. But I just wish it was not with Kylo.
Yeah.
And I'm so torn there because I do think there's such power in you can be a Force user who has intimate love for friends and for lovers, and that's okay. But that story is so creepy.
Well, I mean, and that's the thing is you can't really remove the gender dynamic from it either because it's very different to have Luke redeem his father than it is to have Kylo Ren be redeemed by the love of a good woman.
Yeah, that's a trope we've seen a couple times before.
Yeah, and so even though again I'm not as horrified by the relationship as I would have been after The Force Awakens, I'm not into it and I don't want it.
Mm-hmm.
if there's anybody who needs to have this sort of chaste, meditative process learning mantra applied to them, it's Kylo Ren.
Yeah.
Ben is far too damaged to be. We can't have that story. They can't be making this a story where Rey is going to come along and fix him. That just leaves a terrible taste in my mouth. Please, we can't have that story.
Yeah, I mean, if go ahead.
If Rey gets together with Poe, perhaps, like that could be a thing. That could be interesting. They have like one whole movie to set that up. But like in that sense, because like I'm not opposed to the character of Rey being in a romance, and I think you're right, Matthew, that one of the things that would be a great rejection of is being like, look, the Jedi were clearly wrong. That like rejecting worldly attachments is not the way to create somebody who's going to be a benefit to the world. It just creates problems. But I do think that Becky, I know I'm just like very loudly agreeing with you, but like I cannot emphasize so much how much I don't want Kylo and Rey to be a thing, because that just there's too many bad messages to send to say nothing of the fact that those characters should just be wildly romantically incompatible.
I mean, this will be the 5th or 6th time in this podcast that I have mourned the passing of Carrie Fisher. And I want to be very clear. Carrie Fisher was an amazing person, far beyond what she was as an actress in these movies, and an amazing activist. And I don't for a minute want to say, like, I'm sad that an actual living, breathing woman has passed away because she can't be a character in movies I love. But beyond all that, it is one more part where I think I wonder what could have been movie making, because I think if there is any Force-using person who could be part of the redemption of Kylo, I'd much rather see it be Leia. Like, I would much rather see what that kind of a connection could develop as, instead of it being him and Rey. But obviously that's not the story we're going to get, whether it was ever the story they were intending.
Agree. The one other point actually about fan reaction, speaking of Leia, is that any fanboys who were unhappy that she suddenly and unexpectedly could use the Force, I'm going to say can die mad about it.
Yeah.
It was neither sudden nor unexpected.
Yeah. No, it's only sudden and unexpected if you dismiss literally every contribution she's ever made to the story.
Right.
But unfortunately, I think that a lot of dudes do that when they see a beautiful woman on screen. They kind of forget that she's actually doing things. Or so is also my reaction after watching a lot of Avengers stuff in MCU and the reaction there, and that's a whole other podcast.
Yeah.
But I think female characters' contributions get downplayed, and then people are like, "What? How did she do that?" Well, she's been doing it all along.
Well, and I have two things I'd say there. One is that, and again, I know, Disney has officially erased most of the extended universe that existed in the books, and so it's not canon anymore, and I haven't read tons of them. But one thing I had read in a couple of those books is that there were a couple of different authors who explored the idea that Leia knows she is force sensitive, and that she could develop herself into a Jedi. But that part of her thing is she recognizes, like, I don't want to deal with that temptation. Everyone I know who tries to be a Jedi screws up their life and hurts other people. And that, so it's not by any means her saying, like, that she doesn't want to be a Jedi because she doesn't think she has that power. Is in some ways her being the most responsible of all of them, of saying, like, I have to be knee-deep in the messiness of politics of the New Galactic Republic. I don't want to deal with all this Jedi bullshit, because everyone who does fucks it up. And so I think that's such a powerful thing. And the other thing I wanted to say on that idea of the quibbling is one thing that the movie really highlighted for me is that for me at least, and I have trouble understanding why people can't do this, when a movie has some really powerful themes, I'm willing to forgive plot holes. Like, I think her being force sensitive is completely something that's been set up all the time. But I'll admit, when I saw that scene, I rolled my eyes just a little bit, because I was also like, but she's also been in the vacuum of space, and we've never thought that even the best force user could deal with that. And there was a part of me that, honestly, as much as I love this movie, I do kind of think the idea of a spaceship being just a little bit faster than another spaceship, and thus we get 20 hours of chase scene because of that, that felt like kind of lazy writing, a bad plot point. But to me, I'm able to look at that and go, okay, sure, but that's a plot point that they're using to set up this much deeper point in favor of this great story. So yeah, of course I can roll my eyes a little bit and forgive that. And what I don't understand is the people who would say, well, I can't even look at any of the greater themes because the ship being able to sort of outrun a Star Destroyer but not really just doesn't make any sense.
I actually think it does make sense, but it involves a different take on the physics of the situation.
Okay.
That I will not get into because it has no relevance whatsoever. But needless to say that they've already established in Star Wars that there's a difference between the drive that ships use in normal space travel and light speed drives. And saying that, well, okay, you should just be able to close a very short gap in distance because you are capable of light speed is incorrect, because that's probably incalculable.
So we are going into physics.
Sorry, no. That's the 5-minute version. There's a much larger version that I will not bore our listeners with.
Well, I think for me, Matthew, I think the parallel is when Finn and Rose figure out about the tracking, and the way they describe it, it's like, oh, you are describing a very specific plot point that is a contrivance that has 100% been set up so that you can have this particular storyline.
Exactly.
Okay. Like...
And, like... Oh, go ahead.
It was, like, again, it's one of those things where, like, as a storyteller, I can see the gears turn, and it doesn't feel like, you know, washing over me, and, like, I'm absorbed in it. It feels like, oh, I see what you're doing with that plot point. But I'm not mad about it, because the story was really good.
And that's my point. It's like, yeah, sure, I thought that they didn't contrive as well as they could have contrived. But of all of the flaws that a movie could have, that, you know, I've also seen movies that are, you know, perfectly contrived, but don't make a very good point with it. And I will take this over that any day of the week.
For sure. And I think it's a good thing to realize. And I am not a writer myself, Becky, but I do oftentimes comment about, like, seeing what I think the writers are doing and where I think the story is going. And I agree with you on the, like, a lot of the times when you see that there's this particular contrivance meant to drive the story forward, it can detract from that experience. But in this case, like, I agree with you. I didn't feel like it did at all. I also feel like in some cases the contrivance is overblown because of stupid Gamergate nerds, and I'm not going to get into it, but like, because the arguments themselves were fundamentally flawed in that we weren't actually being presented with the argument they wanted to give. But
to me, when a person says, I have nothing wrong with a female authority figure, I just think that the Admiral's plans were all bullshit. To me, that sounds like the person saying, I have nothing wrong with Black Panther being about a black nation, I just have issues with Marvel in general. It's like, I just can't believe
very
it. Very
transparent.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I want to be cool, because I certainly criticized the Holdo plotline a little bit. And again, I think not to be like, I'm drawing a line and I'm on the right side of it. But I think there is a difference between saying, here's what does and doesn't work as a plot, and saying, well, I was totally fine with the character, but here's a completely unrelated, I didn't like her hat.
Right.
So, like,
yeah. And like,
there's a difference between actual critique and critique that is thinly veiled entitlement because you didn't get what you want or because of Gamergate horribleness.
Right. And that's, again, where I think it's important to acknowledge that there has been critique that's coming from a lot of different directions. Like, to me, while I disagree with the folks who were like, we want the Finn Poe ship or the Finn Ray ship, I think lumping those folks in with the Gamergate is 100% inaccurate. You know, I think that people from all different perspectives on the political screen have been having some critiques of this movie, and there's a lot that, you know, the slash ones I take a lot more seriously, even if I do at the end not see it the same way. Let's kind of transition into the last topic of what are we hoping for the next movie? What, in terms of things that this has set up, and where are we wanting to go? And I want to actually start with kind of a specific question that we tiptoed around but didn't actually address directly, or at least Jacob, I think you answered, but I'm not sure if Becky and I went into it. Do you want to see Rey be a Jedi in the last movie? What do you want to see Rey become in the last movie?
I mean, I guess it depends on if by Jedi you mean person who is capable of using the Force and does so, because yes. If by Jedi you mean strict adherent to the Jedi religion, then no. But yeah, I want to see Rey come into her potential. I want to see her kick Kylo Ren's ass and maybe redeem him, and maybe he dies, and I don't really care how that plays out. And then I want her to be happy and get a pony and a rainbow, and be the best one. That's basically, like, at the end of the day, I want the characters to be happy and have a hopeful ending. I do not want, as I've said, Rey and Kylo Ren to end up together. I think variations on literally any other characters are fine, but Kylo Ren should go sit in a corner and feel bad.
That seems legit.
I would really love for there to be a scene where Ben, now rejecting the title of Kylo Ren and coming full circle, expresses some interest in Rey, and Rey rejects him, and for Ben to go, yeah, that's fair. I want to like that's in my fan fiction canon. I don't think that's actually going to happen in a movie because that would just be fan service for me personally.
And
But
I'd be into it.
yeah, I mean, it's a great scene.
I have to say, in a lot of ways, one of the things that I liked about the connection between Rey and Kylo in this movie is it didn't feel very romantic to me. It felt like two very lonely people looking for connection. And I think in Hollywood terms, when you have two attractive people, especially of different genders, looking for connection, that almost always has to translate into romance. But in some way, if this becomes about a friendship and about you and I understand each other in a way that no one else does, without them adding a romantic connection to it, I think that could be great. But I definitely don't want the romantic aspect of it. What do you? I know I keep alluding to what could have been, but I'm wondering what you think. What happens with Leia in this last movie? Because she ends alive, and they have said, I think, very happily, because it was, I thought, creepy with Admiral Tarkin in Rogue One. They very clearly said they're not going to try and do any Uncanny Valley stuff. Like Carrie Fisher is not going to be a part of the next movie in any way. What? Because I do also think Leia's character has been so central to this entire story, and when we leave off, she is in charge of everything. What could you imagine them doing with her character?
I honestly don't know, because I think losing Leia within this universe feels like such a tragedy, and it seems like something where you could do it really well if you had a story about it, but without having Carrie Fisher, you can't really have that story. I think she deserves better than an off-screen death, but I'm not sure how you have her not be there if she's alive. And so I'm honestly, it's one of the things which I would say, like I said, when you're at the beginning, when you're really emotionally invested, it can be really anxiety causing.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that I am the most anxious about for the next movie.
What if she shows up as a Force ghost? Would that be too much? They would have to.
But I don't think that they would if they're not gonna bring in Carrie Fisher. I do kind of expect Luke to show up as a Force ghost, by the way.
Yeah, I think
sure.
absolutely.
Yeah, that's a lock, I think.
I think that's been confirmed, but I think you're right. I think, and it's going to be. I think the last one might be one of those movies where I have to see a couple of times, because there are movies where I watch them the first time and all I can feel is the disappointment that it's not the movie I want it to be. And then the second time I can watch it and actually really love it. And one of my best examples for this was the new Mad Max movie, because I think it is one of the best post-apocalyptic movies I've ever seen. I loved the original Mad Max movie, and it is not very much in the theme of those movies. And so the first time I saw it, I was disappointed because it wasn't the movie I wanted it to be. It was actually, I think, a much better movie and an amazing movie. But I needed to see it that second time. And I think it's going to be hard for me the first time I see this next movie to not be constantly thinking, oh, what if Princess Leia was in this scene? What if Leia was in this scene? And I think, like, you're right, Becky, I'm going to have that anxiety. And then I think at this point, I trust them enough, the writers enough, to say, I think they'll make a good decision with it. It'll be hard the first time to see it. And then after that, I'll be able to accept it and then just take in the movie for all that it is.
And speaking of other hopes for the next movie, I kind of hope that we see a more evolved. Is the wrong word because he's not like changing as an organism, but a more realized version of Poe, where Poe Dameron is able to take his experiences from The Last Jedi, learn from them, and grow into the kind of leader that the Resistance needs him to be. And that Leia was trying to help mold him into. I would love to see that happen, and I would love to see him acknowledge that that growth needed to happen within himself. That would be kind of cool to do.
I think that would be lovely, and I think that that's something which they could very easily do, since they don't have Leia there as a character. That does sort of narratively mean somebody would need to step up as a leader, and I think that opens up a lot of possibilities for Poe, who, was sort of her protege and was learning a lot from her and had so much respect for her, to mature into somebody she would have been really proud of.
Yeah.
Right, and for him to acknowledge that, and then maybe if they're going to be giving Leia an off-screen death, maybe we can see some of the drama at least some fraction of the drama that moment should have in Dameron's reactions, and that might be a way that they sell it to us.
Well, and one other thing that I'm curious what you guys think of, and again, maybe here we're engaging in the the very thing we were being critical of before, of the speculation of the movie we want to see instead of the movie we'll get. But so we now have established that a cycle occurs, which is a republic is built, and eventually it starts to become either corrupted or just overly bureaucratic, or for whatever reason it starts to decay, and then the empire takes over. And then they attempt to rebuild the republic, and it has some of the same problems and some different ones, and the First Order takes over. How can this movie end? I mean, clearly I think we're going to see the defeat of the First Order. I don't imagine how the movie could be anything else at the end. But what could you imagine them establishing in such a way that breaks that cycle? Or is there a way to break that cycle?
That is a good question. I am fascinated by the way that they've presented it as a cycle, because we're currently experiencing a horrifying rise of fascism that you'd think we would have stomped out a few generations ago, but apparently did not, and now here it is again. Which does not put me in a hopeful frame of mind for saying, yeah, so they can just defeat it and it'll all be fine. But I think some of that same growth beyond the Jedi of saying there were good ideas here, but we can't fully adhere to everything that this Jedi religion taught us. I think that can also be paralleled with the Republic by sort of having a sense of, we're building on what came before, we're trying to strengthen it, we're trying to avoid the pitfalls that let something like the First Order come to power, and that's sort of the best we can do. And then you can't control what happens a few generations later. All you can do is do your best and be vigilant in the time you are now.
Yeah. What's your take, Jacob?
So, excuse me, sorry. So I think that it would be really irresponsible of the writers to have the First Order just go away forever as the outcome of this next movie. And that might sound weird, but what I'm trying to get at there is that I think that it would be more realistic for the Resistance. You know, they get a big victory, but for the First Order to still be extant as a threat. So, like, you know, small victories and the fight goes on, kind of an ending to this particular trilogy. Both because they want to make more movies and make more money and have an even bigger franchise, but also because it's a more realistic story. It more mirrors reality, mirrors life. And the only way I feel you break a cycle like that is by actually changing the hearts and minds, as it were, of the people within that structure, and there's no way they can do that in one movie.
Yeah. I mean, certainly, and I think, and this really goes back to your point about how this cycle is happening in real life. To me, one of the most important things of that cycle is the complacency. You know, is the idea of, and especially I think that the Jedi being such a part of it, of, you know, we are the guardians of goodness in the galaxy, we will take care of everything. That's the complacency and this is one of the few things I thought the prequels did get right, was their idea that the Jedi were so sure of themselves that they missed the fact that the galactic chancellor, the person literally taking over under their noses, was the very thing they were supposed to be dedicated to fighting, and they just didn't see it. And so maybe that kind of to make it about Mad Eye Moody, constant vigilance, you know, has to be the new order of the whatever New Republic is built. We've gone on for quite a while. I think it's been a fantastic conversation. What are kind of any last thoughts that we didn't get to cover from either of you? I know I have one that I want to mention, but what from you guys?
I love Holdo's rad lilac hair.
Yeah. That was really awesome.
So I wanted to, speaking of Holdo, I wanted to, just because we didn't actually go much into it, I didn't want to talk about some of the criticisms of her character, because Becky, you were critical of, and I feel correctly so, of some of the decisions her character made. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think we should make it a point to be very clear that We don't think that the character was poor. The story that Holdo served a role in was poor as a result, because that was one of the criticisms that was coming around, was that what a terrible character, what a terrible person, clearly didn't have the rebellion's best interests at heart. And then why did the writers of this movie feel the need to validate her decisions when they were clearly wrong? I actually felt that many of her decisions, in particular though the ones withholding information, the ones that were most controversial, were correct and in a lot of ways justified by the narrative, even though it was tragic and unfortunate because it drove the very actions that undermined their own plan. So I think it was just a confluence of tragedy rather than being something that is just, entirely the fault of that blasted purple-haired admiral and her dumb ideas.
I do agree with that. I like I said at the very beginning, I didn't think that all of her decisions were justified by the narrative, but I still thought she was a complex, interesting character, and the reason the narrative validated what she was doing and gave her that really awesome heroic moment and literally said she cares more about being a hero than looking like a hero was because she was right. And I think that people who want to continue to argue that she was wrong are maybe not, again, arguing in good faith entirely.
Mm-hmm.
And just because I don't want to completely invalidate alternate opinions from our own, it is entirely possible that they missed it, that they didn't see it, or that there's something that is conflicting with them, that they don't realize that there's another criticism that they have that's not the one that they're voicing, and it's not the one they realize that they have. And so they're voicing this other one because they maybe have read it or other people have said it, and so that's what's been solidified in their head. The ones who are true believers in that idea, I think, need to pay attention.
And Jacob, I hear what you're saying, and I think it's not that 100% of the critique of her is all based in sexism, but I do think that it's important to acknowledge that for a lot of the people who, as you're saying, might be just having trouble seeing it, that sexism and misogyny that they're not acknowledging in themselves is probably a big part of what's making it harder for them to see. Like, I think that's I think I think you can say that there's a gradient between the folks who are just like, oh my God, strong man got critiqued by a woman with lilac hair, we can never have that, and the people for whom it's a lot more subtle. But I do think that it's still there even when it's subtle, and that I think that it's that I think that's the movie being meta is that she specifically says, Poe, is part of why you're questioning me, because, would Poe have questioned Admiral Akbar quite as much? I think it becomes a really important question. And I think that's part of how we view the folks who are having such trouble with her.
Based on the story that we got, I think Poe absolutely would have questioned Admiral Akbar just as much, but, I mean, we can't say, because that's not the story we were given.
I think I would just say kind of my last thought is, and I know, Jacob, you haven't, but Becky, have you seen the Clone Wars TV show?
I have not. I really want to.
Well, and
Same.
The first year is kind of weak, and there still are some weak moments, but I compare it a lot to Batman the Animated Series in that you'll never forget that it's a kid's show, but it's a kid's show that has some incredibly adult moments and some really wonderful ideas. And there were just two things that this movie paid off that I thought were so wonderful that I just want to give a very quick shout out to. One of which is just as part of this long story we've been talking about, the Jedi and love. And I won't give spoilers, but I will just say that one of the major plot points of one of the seasons is Obi-Wan having clearly romantic feelings for another character and deciding that he can't do anything with them because of him being a Jedi. But the obvious internal conflict and there being some moments of him sort of soul searching and wondering, are the Jedi right about this? That I just felt were so paid off by this movie. And that similarly, and this goes to the moment, Becky, you were talking about with Yoda saying, that failure is the greatest teacher. In some of the later seasons of Clone Wars, you see Yoda starting to recognize the corruption of the Jedi and the corruption of the Republic and his own role in that. And it's subtly done, but it is very well done. And it just, to me, made that moment of, like, when Yoda is saying failure is a great teacher, to me, having seen Clone Wars, he's not just talking to Luke, he's also talking to himself in a way that just felt like such a great payoff for this overarching story of, how these heroes failed.
Well, now I even more want to see Clone Wars, so thanks. Guess I have to jump that up another notch on the queue.
It's so, and also because it introduces the idea of Force users who are neither Jedi or Sith, including this badass cult of all women, basically Jedi witches.
Okay, now I really want to see it even more.
Yeah.
So they have the Bene Gesserit, is what you're telling me?
Yeah, it's kind of the Bene Gesserit, and there's a character who's introduced, who starts as a Sith and winds up rejecting the Sith, but staying a Force user. It's so good. Anyway, so that's my plug for Clone Wars, but it's just especially for any of our listeners who are Clone Wars fans as well. I wanted to give those shout outs because I thought that's one of the things that The Last Jedi did was it paid off those parts of that story so well. Well, guys, this has been a wonderful, if very long podcast. It's entirely possible this is going to be a podcast in 2 parts, depending on how much faith we have in our listeners. But I want to just, Becky, you have been a great guest, and you have so many great thoughts that I have both gotten to read and gotten to listen to. And I want our podcasters to get the same chance, because you are now not only a published author with a couple of books to your name, but also beginning to become a podcaster as well. Tell us about how we can find more about Becky Allen and read and enjoy your work.
Sure. So the books are the biggest thing for me, certainly. The first book is Bound by Blood and Sand. The sequel is Freed by Flame and Storm, which came out just a couple months ago. It's only a duology, so the story is done.
Oh, wow.
And it's a young adult fantasy, and I hope that people will check them out and really like them. You can find out more about those at BeckyAllenBooks.com or follow me on Twitter at Allreb, ALLREB. And the podcast is something my sister and I started doing a couple months ago. It's called Rachel and Becky Judge Things, where we hear about things from the internet, maybe things that people really love or think are really bad, and we experience them for ourselves and then record a podcast about it. It is mostly us trying to make each other laugh, but we have talked about The Last Jedi, we talked about Star Wars Discovery, we also talked about The Christmas Prince, and Voltron. So we sort of run the gamut of random stuff that the internet seems to like. And you can see that at RachelAndBeckyJudgeThings.com.
Yeah, it is a great podcast. I really enjoyed it, and I thank you especially because I know a lot of the questions I wanted to ask you was basically a way of saying, can I have you restate for our audience the stuff you said on your own podcast about The Last Jedi? So I'm definitely check that out. Definitely check out your books. Can people buy copies of the books directly through your website?
My website has links to Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and IndieBound. You should be able to get them at bookstores. If they don't have them in stock, you can always ask them to order them. They also should be available from the library. So
Awesome. Jacob, are you starting to say anything?
No.
Okay.
Other than Becky, thank you very much for coming on. It was a great privilege having you on again. I love being able to converse with you on this topic, and I hope we can have you on again, maybe to talk about the next Star Wars movie that comes out.
I gotta say, being asked like, "Hey, do you want to come talk about Star Wars for a while?" is not a bad thing. I really enjoy it as well, so thank you for having me.
Well, good. I will say that while I enjoyed your guys' podcast episode about it, I don't think we're going to be looking for the deep ethical and moral issues of The Christmas Prince anytime soon, which is I think a movie I can say that you guys panned on your podcast, but did a very good job of doing so. But yeah, we will definitely love to have you back to talk about, I loved what you guys had to say about Star Trek, although the whole time, total aside, but and to plug one of our own episodes about Orville, and I'm sure 8 million people have said this to you already, but the whole time you were talking about Star Trek Discovery and all the things you like about it, but also kind of wishing for more of a Star Trek feel. I don't know if you've seen Orville yet, and there is some Seth MacFarlane-ness to fight through, but it does feel very, very Star Trek in ways I want to just kind of throw your way.
Interesting.
So,
well, I'll follow up after the podcast.
Yep, sounds good. All right, well, on behalf of both of you guys, thank you so much. This was if there's anything I want to discuss on this podcast, it's Star Wars, and I'm so glad we got to really dive into it, especially because this movie, as I said, got into what is my favorite part of the whole Star Wars story, which is the idea of the Force and all things like that. We're going to have a lot of show notes. We're going to have a lot of great articles. We didn't even talk about it, but there's an article I read about how understanding the slow corruption of the Jedi that led to things in the Last Jedi even explains midichlorians, which made me so happy, and I'll share with you all. But for you guys listening at home or the office or driving or wherever you're listening, what do you guys think? What were things you loved about this movie? What were things about the movie you found challenging? What do you think of this idea of failure as a story? And what do you want to see with the movie going forward? Do you want to see Rey become a new kind of Jedi or reject the Jedi entirely? You can find us on both Facebook and Twitter at Superhero Ethics, and we love to keep the conversation going on both of those platforms. You can email us with any questions or thoughts at Facebook at superheroethics@gmail.com. Anything you want to say on this? Or I will also say that our next podcast is going to be on the book series by Brandon Sanderson. Is that right, Jacob?
Brandon Sanderson. That is correct.
Yeah, Brandon Sanderson. We're going to be talking about the book The Way of Kings, and a lot of the topics it brings up, especially about honor and the role of honor in fantasy novels and things like that. So if you have questions or ideas you want to throw at us about that, hit us up on Facebook or Twitter or email us. On behalf of myself, on behalf of Jacob and Becky, thank you guys all for sticking through and listening to all this. Have a great night. Bye-bye.